Hi, welcome to Kiwi Hellenist. My name's Peter Gainsford. I live in New Zealand. I do research on ancient Greece. This is the first part of a series on the Odyssey of Homer. A lot of people are locked away alone or in their own homes at the moment, and I figure this is as good a time as any for people to be picking up a book. And why not one of the classics? The Odyssey has been tremendously popular for more than 2,000 years. Anyone can read it. It's immediately accessible. You really don't need any kind of introduction to read it. It's full of memorable characters, memorable scenes like the Cyclops, the bow contest of Odysseus, the Lotus Eaters, Scylla and Charybdis, loads more. It doesn't really need introduction. You can read it without any guidance at all. But there is always more to see beneath the surface. So if you are interested, I hope you will join in and have a go at reading it, and join me to find out about some of the things that may not be quite so obvious to a modern reader. As I said, it's immediately accessible. It is also a little bit problematic in some ways for a modern audience. It's viciously classist, it's viciously misogynistic, and I do mean by the standards of the time when it was composed. We'll come back to that in later episodes. But if you can get past those problems, it is still worth reading. It's also hugely influential. It's generated so many copies of the idea of the personal journey, someone going in search of something, coming back, journeys of self-discovery. Just a few days ago, I saw an article on the website Film School Rejects about how Pixar films are obsessed with the idea of the Odyssey and this idea of a personal journey. And of course, there's loads more. You can just sort of Google Odyssey and you'll find thousands of results, thousands of books and films and all sorts of things that are inspired by Homer. But as I said, there's a huge amount that a modern reader is likely not to notice. You'll enjoy it. I promise you'll enjoy it, because it's got great storytelling. But if you do notice these hidden depths, it will only add to your experience. So I invite you to join me in reading the Odyssey. Almost any translation will do, but I strongly recommend ones from since, say, 1950 or so. Try to avoid older ones, and I'm afraid most of the ones you'll find online for free are older ones. Try to avoid the copies that you'll find on Project Gutenberg. Try to avoid old old translations into rhyming verse by people like Alexander Pope or William Cooper. Try to avoid Butcher and Lang. I mean, unless your taste really does run to that kind of thing, you're going to find it more of an obstacle than anything else. I would stick with relatively modern, relatively straightforward translations. So my recommendations would be particularly for Martin Hammond for a prose translation, for translations that aim slightly at a more verse, poetic flavour. You could go for Alan Mandelbaum, Robert Fagles, Emily Wilson. One of my favourites is Rodney Merrill, because he actually imitates the rhythms of Homeric poetry. Also, try to avoid Walter Schurring. There's lots of problems with that translation, but I don't think we better get into that just now. In these videos, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the reading experience, not on presenting raw facts. If you want to find out when the Odyssey was composed or what the book-by-book summary is, you can go to Wikipedia for that, or SparkNotes. The Odyssey is a living, breathing story, and what we're looking at here is how you interact with the Odyssey, how you read it. So, as I said, just to sum up, you will enjoy reading the Odyssey, whether you listen to me or not. But I think if you stick with me, you will find that you'll be better at reading it. You'll be a more skilled reader. You'll be better at seeing the depths that pass by a lot of readers. So, for today's introductory session, we do have to think about what the Odyssey is. Now, what is the Odyssey? It's not a novel. It's not a poem in the sense that most people think of poetry. It's not a film, it's not a play, it's something a little bit in between. It's a genre that we don't really have much of nowadays. Novel is probably the closest analogue. What is the Odyssey? Let's take a look at the first sentence of the Wikipedia article, just to see what they say. And here's what they say. The Odyssey is one of two major ancient Greek epic poems attributed to Homer. Okay, fine. There's a few things that need unraveling there. And these three things are the ones that I'd like to pick up on for the rest of this video. The idea of what it means to say that it's a poem, what it means to say that it's an epic, and what we mean by Homer. So first, thinking about the poem. I'll read out the first few lines of the Odyssey to you in ancient Greek, just to give you a flavour of the kind of sound that you can expect is going on throughout the whole thing. I'll give you a translation first, and today's translation is the one by Emily Wilson, published 2017. In her translation, the first 5 lines go as follows. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went, and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. And that's the translation. Here's how it sounds in Greek. Today I'll try and use a mix of pronunciation styles. Today I'm going to try and go for a reconstructed ancient Greek pronunciation. This is roughly how it would have sounded. Andra moi enne pamusa, polutropon hos malapolla plankthe, epe troies hieron ptolietron eperse, pollon dantropon, idanaste kai non egno, polladogen pontoi, paten algehon katatumon, arnumenos hen te psychen, kai noston hetairon. Now, there's a fairly steady dum-da-da-dum-da-da-dum rhythm going on there. Like in the first line, Andra moi enne pamusa polutropon hos malapolla. That rhythm, a dactylic rhythm, is the rhythm that goes on throughout the whole of the epic. Every line has that underlying dum-da-da-dum-da-da riff going on. So don't think of it so much as a song. We're not talking song lyrics here. Think more in terms of the kind of rhythms that you get in a very rhythmic hip-hop style, because that's the kind of phraseology that you get in Homer. A phrase-by-phrase translation would sound a lot more like hip-hop than it would sound like classical English verse. Maybe I'll try and do that, do a hip-hop style translation in a later video. Not today, though. So anyway, that's the sound. That's the poetry. The dum-da-da-dum-da-da poetry rhythm going all the way through. There's no rhyme. Rhyme is very rare in ancient verse, but instead we have this really strong rhythm. Okay, poem. What about epic? What does it mean to call the Odyssey an epic? Well, epic is a bit of a loaded word in English. You need to be cautious when using words like that, because everyone has their own ideas of what epic means. It is a translation of a Greek word. The Greek word is epos, which means just spoken word. Now that doesn't actually tell us a huge amount. It tells us that we're thinking about the sound. We're thinking about epic as a spoken genre. It's a performance genre. It's not something that that ancient people would have read in an armchair. It's something that they went to a concert or a performance, a recital. But it doesn't tell us a huge amount about the epic. Just understand that it means spoken word. Again, let's look at a reference work. Here's what the Oxford English Dictionary says on the subject of epic. And the OED says, epic means, quote, pertaining to that species of poetical composition represented typically by the Iliad and Odyssey, which celebrates, in the form of a continuous narrative, the achievements of one or more heroic personages of history or tradition. So, represented typically by the Iliad and Odyssey. I love this definition because it's so circular. What is it that makes the Odyssey an epic? Answer, the fact that it's like the Iliad and Odyssey. Well, that's not very helpful, is it? Well, okay, let's move on to some other ways of thinking about what epic means. When we use epic nowadays in modern English, we're normally going to be talking about the character. It's going to be grandiose, there's going to be battles, it's long, there's a really long-standing build-up towards a climax. Think of the charge of the Rohirrim in The Lord of the Rings. Think of the final battle in Avengers Endgame. For heroic violence, you've got superhero films, you've got John Wick, all of this grandiosity. That's the kind of sense that it conjures up. And actually that works pretty well for the Iliad, but not so much for the Odyssey, because there are lots of exceptions in ancient epic to this description. Within the Odyssey, you've got conversations between Odysseus and one of his herdsmen, the character Eumaeus, in a farmhouse. This is not grandiose. It is long, okay, fine, but we know of lots of ancient epics that were pretty short. We've got one surviving example called the Aspis, or the Shield, which is about 1/20th the size of the Odyssey. And we've got lots of evidence of other short ones too. What about battles? Well, we've got one pitched battle in the Odyssey, but only one, and it's right near the end. So that is not really a very good guide to what we should be expecting in the Odyssey either. Let's think of another way. What about literary criticism? Well, in older style literary criticism, it used to be the custom to talk about epic in terms of two main categories: primary epic versus secondary epic. Now, what do these mean? Primary epic means epic that's geared for oral performance and oral traditions. Secondary epic would be more literary, for reading in an armchair. So, for example, Homer would be a primary epic, or the Iliad and Odyssey would be primary. So would some other, really, really ancient epics from oral traditions, like Beowulf. In the secondary camp, you'd have things like Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid, John Milton's epic Paradise Lost, and in other languages and other cultures, you'd have things like the Persian Shahnameh, the German Nibelungenlied. And then you can have mixed ones, like the classical Indian epics, the Song of Roland, the Kalevala from Finland. The idea of this distinction is that, with the two different categories, you have to use different rules of literary criticism. Okay, there's some merit to that to some extent, but, if you're sitting at home in quarantine, or wherever you happen to be right now, and you're reading the Odyssey in a book, that's not really going to affect how you read it. So I don't think this is a very useful distinction. Maybe for scholars it can be useful, but for readers, I don't think it's quite so useful. One last way of taxonomizing epic is to think about the common motifs and stylistic elements that make it up. There's the verse form, which I mentioned earlier, the dum-da-da-dum-da-da rhythm. There's the fact that epics are typically divided into books. The Odyssey comes in 24 books. Now, when we say books, we don't actually mean books. Even in antiquity, one book of the Odyssey was way too short for a single scroll. You'd have several books per scroll, almost certainly. So what exactly this division into books means is a little bit harder to judge, but that's the conventional term that we use, and later epics use the same idea, usually multiples of 6 books for some reason. So the Odyssey is in 24 books, so is the Iliad. Virgil's Aeneid is 12 books, Lucretius 6 books, Statius is 12 books, Milton is 12 books, and then you have a few odd ones out, like Ovid. Okay, so that's one of the more common sort of devices, the formal features, the way that the text is given to us. Then you've got poetic motifs, things like the invocation of the muse at the beginning. Remember how it began. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost. So we're addressing the muse, a divine figure who's supposed to be telling the story through us, or through the narrator. That's a common feature in classical epics. Similes are when you sort of compare something going on in the story to something, usually something from the natural world. Like, for example, you could have 2 warriors leaping at each other, as when rocks leap from a high mountain peak and fall on each other, so they clashed together. Bang, crash, wallop, noise. It's a way of adding layers of meaning to a story. You can have catalogues. The Iliad, the Homeric Iliad has a catalogue of ships. The Odyssey has catalogues of heroes and heroines that Odysseus meets, of heroes and heroines of the past. You could have a catalogue of Argonauts in a poem about the voyage of the Argonauts, Jason and the voyage of the Argo. And you have lots of set-piece scenes, like when a hero goes on a rampage in battle, arming scenes, preparing for battle, hospitality, when someone welcomes you into their home. There's a typical sequence that things follow, feast scenes. All of this is accurate enough, and you can analyze the Odyssey to death using this kind of structural feature and the traditional tropes that I've mentioned. But again, I'm not sure how much use this is going to be to someone who's just sitting down wanting to read the Odyssey. No modern reader is going into any epic armed with a list of tropes. It's just not that useful. So the upshot, I think, has to be that there's no single definition of epic. Just treat it as a story and take it for what it is. It isn't really going to affect how you read it anyway. Just be prepared for a certain amount of stylizedness. Enough said about epic, I think. Let's move on to author, and this is the last thing that we have to talk about. Homer. What do we mean when we say that the Odyssey is attributed? What was the Wikipedia phrase? Attributed to Homer. What does that mean? Why don't we just say the Odyssey written by Homer? Well, for what is it, nearly over 200 years now, it's been a big scholarly question and debate over the identity and name of the person or people who composed the Iliad and Odyssey. It's been a very popular question among scholars. Even some students and general readers quite like the question as well. But a lot of the time you can get away with not caring about it. I mean, how is it going to affect how you read the story? It does have a certain impact. What you use the Odyssey for. For example, what do I mean by that? People who use Homer as a guide to the Bronze Age, as a mirror to things that actually happened in the late Bronze Age, in the 12th century BCE, and archaeologists who try to excavate well, even some modern archaeologists, but I'm thinking of someone like Heinrich Schliemann, who excavated at Troy, basically treated the Homeric epics as these two monumental compositions by a single creative genius named Homer. This is a viewpoint that nowadays we call Unitarian, and it's not at all obvious that that is the right way to treat the poems. There are lots of other possibilities. Rather than giving you a history of 200 years of Homeric scholarship, I think this question is best approached not by thinking about the actual author, but about the author's persona. We're interested in the persona, not the person. You take the difference. The narrator of the Odyssey may or may not have been someone named Homer. Let's leave that aside. But what is clear, and what I think everyone can agree on, is that he adopts the persona of Homer. This is most obvious in Odyssey Book 8. There's a scene where we meet a blind bard by the name of Demodocus. He is revered by the people around him. He is welcomed into a prestigious hall. He puts on a performance which everyone listens to. They're all on tenterhooks and they applaud him. He's surrounded by wealth. I mean, this is clearly a model for the treatment of how the narrator wants performers of epic to be treated in real life. And, the fact that he's blind. Everyone knows Homer is supposed to be blind, right? Well, Demodocus is blind. A similar situation happens in another poem called the Hymn to Apollo, the Homeric Hymn to Apollo. Partway through, the narrator adopts the persona of Homer, again as a blind poet from Chios, and that's one of the traditional birthplaces for Homer. But in that case, we know that the poet is definitely not Homer. It's over a century later than the Iliad and Odyssey, and we do actually have a name for him. His name was Kinaithos, but he's adopting the persona of Homer. This is not something unusual or unexpected or remarkable. This is a very standard thing for early Greek poetry to do. Loads and loads of early Greek poetry lays a really strong emphasis on the persona of the poet, the narrator, and usually this emerges as an interest in the poet's backstory. For example, the poetry of Solon and Sappho, two of the greatest lyric poets of early Greece. Solon and Sappho, the poems, the fragments that we have, frequently refer to their backstories. Both figures have a richly detailed biographical tradition, and it's reasonably likely that they were real historical individuals. But when you see Solon always making claims about, I am Solon and I have come here to tell you this, blah, blah, blah. Or when you see Sappho talking about her family, or about a wildly unlikely romantic love affair with this guy called Phaon that led to her suicide, that's sounding much more, I don't want to say fictional, but it's using the poet's backstory. It's adopting the poet as a persona. Sappho's love affair with Phaon is drastically unlikely to be real, but we're told that it was there in her actual poems. It would be a mistake to take these as just, sort of lucky corroborations of the biographical traditions. What's going on is that the poets are using the biographical traditions. They're laying claim to them. They're laying claim to the persona. You've got some extreme cases with figures who are really, really obviously fictional. There's one by the name of Epimenides. Reportedly, he went to sleep for 50 years. Now, okay, clearly that's false, but where does that come from? Probably from, if we had more of Epimenides' poetry, we would find that in the poems. There's Linos, or Linus. Most accounts have him as a son of Apollo. Again, we don't believe in Apollo nowadays, so we treat that as fictional. Or there's one of the most exciting figures is Aborus, a figure called Aborus of Hyperborea. And the evidence there focuses really, really heavily on a fictional biography. He's supposed to be this priest of Apollo from somewhere in the Ukraine. He comes south to visit Greece. He carries a giant arrow, which used to belong to Apollo himself, and he actually uses this giant arrow to fly around and fly across rivers and swamps and things like that. All of this stuff must come from the poems. This is someone taking an obviously fictional biography and adapting it and adopting the persona. And then we have cases like the Kinaithos that I mentioned, where Kinaithos adopts the persona of Homer, and we know that it's not Homer because we know that it's Kinaithos. There's a similar case with one of the poems attributed to another legendary poet called Musaios. We're told in one ancient source that there was another poet called Onomacritus who was found to have tried to deceive people by writing poetry under Musaios' name, and he got exiled for that. So, I mean, that's another case of someone adopting a persona. Anyway, the upshot of this is, in the Odyssey, whenever you see a poet, and you will see poets reasonably often, several times throughout the epic, whenever you see a poet, that is a self-insertion. It's a kind of a literary avatar of not the actual poet, not the actual composer or the performer, but an avatar of the persona of Homer. That is Homer self-inserting himself. Whether Homer was real or not, we don't need to care about whether he was real. The persona was real. That's the main thing. Okay, I'm going to finish there today. Thank you very much for listening. Next time, in the second session, we're going to look at the opening of the Odyssey in a bit more detail, and we're going to look at the story that spreads across the first 4 books of the journey of Odysseus' son Telemachus. He goes roaming far and wide in search of his father. We'll be looking at how the epic uses time in these episodes, how it uses time as a storytelling device, and looking at some things that are linked to the use of time in epic. we'll be touching on exciting things like solar eclipses and Odysseus's death. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you will be able to join me next time and get busy reading the Odyssey. Bye for now.